The fluorescent lights in Chicago's 15th precinct buzzed with their usual irritating persistence as Officer James Sullivan gathered his gear for another night shift. February's bitter wind howled outside, promising one of those bone-chilling nights that made even hardened cops question their career choices. James adjusted his bulletproof vest, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing over his 15 years on the force. His fingers brushed against the small pendant hidden beneath his uniform, Sarah's cross, the last thing she'd given him before cancer stole her away 2 years ago. "Sullivan!" Sergeant Martinez's voice cut through the locker room's familiar cacophony of slamming metal doors and muffled radio chatter. "Got a call about suspicious activity at that old Westbrook pharmaceutical warehouse on 43rd. Probably just some kids looking for trouble, but check it out." James nodded, already reaching for his keys. The warehouse district was a magnet for trouble these days, abandoned buildings standing like hollow-eyed sentinels over streets that had long since lost their industrial pulse. As he climbed into his patrol car, the dashboard clock blinked 11:42 p.m. That dead zone of night when the honest folks were home in bed, and the city belonged to shadows. The drive was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of dispatch radio and the rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers fighting against the sleety mix falling from Chicago's iron-gray sky. James had walked these streets as a rookie, watched them change as factories closed and poverty crept in like frost, claiming everything it touched. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every blind alley where trouble could hide. Westbrook Pharmaceuticals' massive structure loomed ahead, its broken windows gaping like missing teeth in the sodium vapor glow of distant streetlights. James killed his headlights as he approached, years of experience teaching him that surprise was often his best ally. The building had been empty for nearly a decade, but its skeleton still held secrets. Drug deals, homeless camps, and sometimes things far darker. As he stepped out of his patrol car, the wind cut through his uniform like icy needles. His boots crunched on a mixture of frozen gravel and broken glass, each step echoing in the vast emptiness surrounding him. The main entrance was chained shut, but a service door hung ajar, its lock long since defeated by time and determined intruders. James drew his flashlight but kept it off, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The air inside the warehouse was stale, heavy with the musty breath of abandonment and the sharp tang of rust. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady metronome counting seconds in the void. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, not out of fear, but from the ingrained caution that had kept him alive on these streets. The beam of his flashlight revealed a wasteland of twisted metal and debris, shadows dancing across walls tagged with layers of graffiti like urban cave paintings. Empty bottles and needles crunched beneath his feet, telling stories of desperate nights and lost souls. But something was different tonight. There was a freshness to the air in certain spots, suggesting recent movement. A sound, so faint, it might have been imagination, drew his attention to the back of the warehouse. James moved silently, years of experience guiding his steps around potential noisemakers. As he approached the source, the sound crystallized into something that made his heart clench. The muffled sob of a child trying desperately not to be heard. In the far corner, behind a collapsed section of shelving, his flashlight beam found a small figure huddled against the wall. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, though malnutrition and hardship made age a slippery thing to judge. He was wearing layers of clothes, all in various states of dirt and disrepair, and clutching a worn backpack like it was a shield against the world. James had seen that look before, in the eyes of abuse victims, in runners, in kids who'd learned too young that adults couldn't be trusted. The boy's dark eyes were wide with fear but held something else, a defiance that spoke of a spirit not yet broken by whatever circumstances had led him to this place. "Hey there, buddy," James said softly, crouching down to remove the height advantage that often intimidated children. He kept his flashlight pointed at the ground, illuminating the space between them without blinding the boy. "I'm Officer Sullivan, but you can call me James. What's your name?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the persistent drip of water and the distant wail of a siren. The boy's eyes darted to the exit behind James, calculating odds that the officer had seen too many runners consider. James remained still, knowing that any sudden movement could shatter this fragile moment. "You're not in trouble," he continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I just want to make sure you're safe. It's pretty cold out here tonight." He noticed the boy's hands were red and chapped from the cold, and there was a fresh scrape on his chin that hadn't been properly cleaned. More silence. James settled himself more comfortably, showing he was willing to wait. "You know, I've got some hot chocolate in my car. Real stuff, not that powder mix. My partner says I'm crazy for keeping a thermos of it, but nights like this, it comes in handy." The mention of hot chocolate caused the smallest shift in the boy's expression. A flicker of longing quickly suppressed. James had seen enough hungry kids to recognize the signs: slightly sunken cheeks, the way his eyes had lingered for just a moment too long on the mention of a drink. "I'm not going back," the boy suddenly whispered, his voice hoarse as if from disuse. "You can't make me go back there." "Back where?" James asked, careful to keep his tone neutral, despite the concern rising in his chest. The boy's reaction suggested he was running from something specific, not just general hardship. Another long pause, filled with the weight of unspoken trauma. Finally, barely audible, "Marcus. My name is Marcus." James nodded, offering a small smile. "Nice to meet you, Marcus. Listen, how about we start with that hot chocolate? No tricks, no pressure, just something warm to drink while we talk. You can keep your backpack, stay right where you can see the exit, and if you decide you don't want to talk to me after that, well, we'll figure something out." Marcus studied him with an intensity that seemed beyond his years, as if trying to read truth or lies in James's face. The officer remained still, letting himself be examined. He'd learned long ago that trust had to be earned, especially from kids who'd had every reason to lose faith in adults. Finally, Marcus gave a tiny nod, though his grip on the backpack didn't loosen. As James slowly stood to retrieve the thermos from his car, he felt something shift in the air between them. Not quite trust, but perhaps its distant cousin, hope. What he didn't know then, as he radioed dispatch to report finding a minor, was that this moment in a derelict warehouse would set in motion events that would change not only his life, but potentially the course of history. All he knew was that something about this boy's eyes, haunted yet fierce with determination, reminded him of himself at that age, and of all the times he'd wished someone had cared enough to stop and really see him. The warehouse groaned in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled midnight. In that moment, in that place of rust and shadows, two lives intersected in a way that would prove to be either providence or tragedy. Though it would take years to know which. The fluorescent lights of Chicago's Department of Child Services buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. James sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching Marcus through the window of the interview room. The social worker, Miss Chen, was reviewing his file with an expression James had seen too many times. The look of someone trying to fit too many broken pieces into too few solutions. "Officer Sullivan," Miss Chen began, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "I appreciate your bringing Marcus in, but we're facing some serious challenges here." She shuffled through papers that told Marcus's story in cold, bureaucratic terms. He's been through 4 foster homes in the past 2 years. There are incidents of running away, behavioral issues, and... She trailed off, tapping a particularly dense paragraph of text. James watched as Marcus traced patterns on the table with his finger, his other hand still clutching that worn backpack. In the harsh light of day, the boy looked even more vulnerable than he had in the warehouse. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights, and his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. What about his biological family? James heard himself asking, though he already suspected the answer. Miss Chen's silence spoke volumes before her words did. Mother died of an overdose when he was 8. Father's identity unknown. There was a grandmother in Milwaukee, but she passed away last year. That's when the cycling through foster homes began. The weight of those words settled in James's chest, mixing with memories of his own empty house. He thought of Sarah's craft room, still untouched after 2 years. Collection dust like the remnants of dreams they'd never gotten to fulfill. They'd always talked about having kids, but cancer had other plans. The nearest available placement is in Rockford. Miss, Chen continued, her voice taking on the practiced detachment of someone who had delivered too many pieces of bad news. It's a group home, fairly stable record, but they're already over capacity. Marcus would be sharing a room with 3 other boys. James watched as a social services intern brought Marcus a sandwich. The boy waited until she left before eating, taking small, measured bites as if afraid someone might take it away. Each careful movement spoke of lessons learned the hard way about trust and survival. "What's the process?" James found himself asking, surprising both himself and Miss Chen. "For becoming a foster parent?" Miss Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Officer Sullivan, with all due respect, taking in a child, especially one with Marcus's history, is a massive responsibility. The vetting process alone takes weeks, and that's before we even consider the training requirements. Home studies, background checks." "I've got the time," James interrupted quietly, his eyes still on Marcus. "And the space. My house has been empty too long." The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and preparations. James found himself navigating a labyrinth of bureaucratic requirements, each step bringing its own challenges and revelations. His fellow officers alternated between supportive encouragement and concerned warnings about taking on too much. His house, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, suddenly seemed both too empty and not ready enough. He spent his off hours cleaning out Sarah's craft room, each item carefully packed away in boxes labeled with her neat handwriting. Sometimes he'd find himself sitting among half-packed boxes, holding one of her paintbrushes or a skein of yarn, wondering what she would think of his decision. The home study brought its own anxieties. James had never been so aware of every crack in his walls, every dust bunny under furniture. The social worker assigned to his case, a veteran named Robert Torres, walked through each room with careful attention, asking questions that probed not just the physical space but James's readiness for this responsibility. "Tell me, Officer Sullivan," Torres asked as they sat at the kitchen table, "what makes you think you're prepared to handle a child with Marcus's particular challenges?" James considered the question carefully, turning his coffee mug between his hands. "I've seen what happens to kids who fall through the cracks," he finally answered. "In my job, I usually meet them too late, when they're already heading down paths they can't easily turn back from. With Marcus, there's still time, and maybe what he needs isn't another institution or overcrowded group home. Maybe he needs someone who'll just be there, consistently, even when things get hard." The training sessions were eye-opening. James found himself in classes about trauma-informed care, learning about attachment disorders and the impacts of early childhood neglect. Each lesson seemed to illuminate another aspect of Marcus's behavior: the food hoarding, the trust issues, the intense fear of abandonment masked by aggressive independence. His fellow trainees were a diverse group: young couples, single parents, retirees, all seeking to open their homes for different reasons. During breaks, they shared their stories and anxieties. A retired teacher wanted to help special needs children. A young couple couldn't have children of their own. Their hope and determination helped bolster James's resolve during moments of doubt. Meanwhile, Marcus remained in temporary emergency placement, and James was allowed supervised visits. Their interactions were awkward at first, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory. James brought books he'd noticed Marcus eyeing during their first meeting at the warehouse, well-worn copies of science texts and nature guides that had belonged to Sarah. During one visit, as Marcus carefully turned the pages of a book about chemistry, he suddenly spoke without looking up. "Why are you doing all this?" The question caught James off guard, but he recognized the weight behind it. "Because everyone deserves a chance at something better," he answered honestly, "and because sometimes life puts people in our path for a reason." Marcus's fingers traced a diagram of molecular bonds. "The other ones all gave up," he said quietly. When it got hard, they said they wanted to help, but they didn't really mean it. I'm not them, James replied simply, and I don't give up easily. The approval finally came on a Wednesday afternoon. James was at his desk at the precinct when the call came through. Miss Chen's voice carried a mix of professional efficiency and cautious optimism as she explained the next steps. There would be a 2-month trial period, weekly check-ins, continued counseling for Marcus, and a support system in place if issues arose. The day James brought Marcus home was oddly anticlimactic. The boy's possessions fit in a single duffel bag, besides his ever-present backpack. He stood in the doorway of his new room, Sarah's old craft room, now transformed with a fresh coat of paint and new furniture, with an expression that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. You can decorate it however you want, James offered, watching as Marcus ran his hand along the desk by the window. Make it your own space. Marcus nodded, but said nothing, his posture still carrying the tension of someone ready to run at the first sign of trouble. James recognized it would take time, perhaps a very long time, before the boy would truly believe this could be permanent. That first night, as James lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving through his house, he thought about Sarah. He could almost hear her laugh, see her shaking her head at him taking on such a monumental challenge. But he also knew she would have understood. She had always believed in second chances, in the power of small kindnesses to change lives. Thunder rolled in the distance, heralding an approaching storm. In the room down the hall, he heard Marcus's footsteps, too quick and regular to be sleepwalking. The boy was pacing, probably fighting his own battles with insomnia and uncertainty. James considered getting up, offering company or comfort, but held back. Some journeys had to be taken one small step at a time, and trust couldn't be rushed. The first signs of trouble came 3 weeks after Marcus moved in. James woke to the sound of breaking glass at 2 a.m., his police instincts kicking in before his mind fully registered being awake. He found Marcus in the kitchen, surrounded by shattered pieces of what had been Sarah's favorite ceramic bowl, his hands trembling as he tried to gather the fragments. I was just hungry, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't mean to. I'll replace it. I promise. Please don't. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush, his eyes already darting toward the nearest exit. James carefully knelt beside him, mindful of the sharp edges scattered across the floor. It's okay, he said softly, reaching for the broom instead of the broken pieces. We all break things sometimes. Let's clean this up together, and then we'll make something to eat. That night became a pattern. Broken things, both physical and emotional, followed by moments of quiet rebuilding. The school counselor called weekly, reporting outbursts that ranged from complete withdrawal to violent confrontations with classmates. Marcus's nightmares echoed through the house, screams that made James's heart race, even after he learned they weren't from immediate danger. The hidden things started appearing too. James found stolen items tucked away in Marcus's room. Small things at first, a classmate's pencil case, a teacher's stapler, candy bars from the corner store. Then bigger items, a neighbor's package, a wallet from the park, electronics from the school's computer lab. Each discovery led to conversations that felt like navigating a minefield. Why do you need these things? James would ask, laying out the found items without accusation. Marcus's answers varied, but carried the same underlying fear. In case I have to leave. For trading. Because no one else would give them to me. Each response was a window into years of learned survival strategies, of never knowing when everything might be taken away again. The running attempts began in spring. The first time, James found Marcus 3 blocks away, huddled behind the public library with his backpack and a handful of granola bars. The second time, he made it to the bus station before James tracked him down. The third time, he didn't even make it past the front yard. James found him sitting on the porch steps at midnight, crying silently into his knees. I don't know how to stay, Marcus admitted that night, his words barely audible above the chorus of cicadas. Every time things start feeling okay, I mess it up. I always mess it up. James sat beside him, careful to maintain the space Marcus needed. You're not messing anything up? he said firmly. "This is part of figuring things out. I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. Not unless you really want to." The academic struggles were perhaps the most frustrating, because James could see the brilliant mind hiding behind the behavioral issues. Marcus's test scores showed exceptional aptitude in science and mathematics, but his attendance was sporadic, and his homework went untouched. Teachers' notes spoke of a student who could solve complex equations in his head but refused to show his work, who could recite chemical formulas from memory but wouldn't participate in group projects. It was during a parent-teacher conference that James first glimpsed the potential brewing beneath the chaos. Marcus's chemistry teacher, Dr. Hayes, pulled out a notebook she'd confiscated during class. The pages were filled with detailed molecular diagrams and complex calculations that went far beyond ninth-grade level work. He was working on this instead of the assigned lab. "Dr. Hayes explained, her expression mixing frustration and amazement. When I asked him about it, he said he was trying to improve the efficiency of enzyme catalysis in biological systems. This is graduate-level research. Officer Sullivan, your boy has an extraordinary mind. If we can just get him to channel it properly." The counseling sessions were their own battlefield. Marcus would sit in stubborn silence, or explode in bursts of rage that left the office in disarray. Different therapists tried different approaches: art therapy, play therapy, cognitive behavioral techniques. Some made small progress before Marcus's walls slammed back into place. One counselor, Dr. Martinez, finally broke through by bringing in a chemistry set and conducting their sessions while they worked on experiments together. "Sometimes," she explained to James, "trauma survivors can only process their emotions when their hands are busy with something else." The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday in October, almost a year after Marcus had first arrived. James came home from a late shift to find every light in the house blazing and Marcus surrounded by papers at the dining room table, working with an intensity he'd never seen before. "I think I figured it out," Marcus said without looking up, his pen flying across pages of calculations. "Why the last foster home didn't work? Why none of them worked?" He paused, his hand hovering over the paper. "They wanted me to be grateful, to act like they were saving me, but you." He finally looked up, meeting James's eyes. "You just let me be broken until I could figure out how to fix myself." The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Then Marcus returned to his work, and James went to make coffee, knowing neither of them would sleep much that night. As he watched Marcus work, he noticed something different in his posture, a subtle shift from defensive tension to focused determination. That same week, Marcus's chemistry teacher reported his first voluntary class participation. He joined the science club, though he sat apart from the other students. His nightmares didn't stop, but now when he woke screaming, he would allow James to sit with him, sometimes even talking about the fragments of memories that haunted him. The stolen items began appearing on James's desk, returned voluntarily with short notes of apology. The running attempts became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Small changes accumulated like layers of sediment, gradually building a foundation of stability. But James noticed something else emerging too, a fierce intensity in Marcus's pursuit of knowledge, particularly in his independent research. The boy would spend hours in the school lab after classes, and his room became a chaos of scientific journals and chemical equations scrawled on every available surface. When asked about his projects, Marcus would become evasive, his answers vague but his eyes burning with a purpose that James couldn't quite read. Late at night, James would sometimes hear him talking to himself, fragments of scientific terminology, mixing with what sounded like plans or promises. The words were too muffled to make out clearly, but their tone carried a weight that made James uneasy. It was like watching a storm gather on the horizon, beautiful and terrifying in its potential for both creation and destruction. The transformation began quietly, like most revolutions do. Marcus's 14th birthday arrived with little fanfare. He'd never been comfortable with celebrations, but James noticed the change that seemed to crystallize around that date. The angry, defensive child began giving way to something else entirely, something that both impressed and unsettled him. Marcus's bedroom evolved into what looked like a cross between a laboratory and a war room. Complex molecular diagrams covered the walls, interconnected with red string and annotated with cramped handwriting that grew increasingly cryptic. James would catch glimpses of the notes when he brought up laundry, but the technical jargon was beyond his understanding. Words like protein synthesis inhibitors and molecular cage structures jumped out from pages of dense calculations. The school's science department became Marcus's second home. Dr. Hayes, his chemistry teacher, had given him special permission to use the lab after hours, impressed by his dedication and unprecedented aptitude. She shared her observations with James during their monthly check-ins. "I've never seen anything like it," she admitted, showing James a paper Marcus had written on enzyme catalysis. "He's not just learning the material, he's finding connections that experts in the field haven't discovered yet." Last week, he corrected a mistake in a college-level textbook and had the supporting research to prove it. Universities started taking notice. Harvard's biochemistry department reached out after Marcus published a theoretical paper in an undergraduate journal under a pseudonym. MIT expressed interest in his novel approach to protein folding. Scholarship offers began arriving in the mail, though Marcus seemed oddly uninterested in them, treating them as distractions from his true work. At home, Marcus's behavior became increasingly enigmatic. James would find strange chemical orders arriving at the house. Nothing illegal, but unusual combinations that raised his investigative instincts. When questioned, Marcus would deflect with technical explanations that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. "It's just for a project I'm working on," he'd say, his eyes focused on his computer screen where molecular models rotated in complex patterns. "Nothing dangerous, I promise. You trust me, right?" And James did trust him, mostly. But there were moments when he'd catch Marcus watching news reports about chemical weapons with an intensity that seemed more than academic interest. Or he'd overhear fragments of late-night phone calls in which Marcus spoke in careful code about delivery systems and activation protocols. The basement gradually transformed into an improvised laboratory, equipment acquired piece by piece through science club grants and competition winnings. James helped him set it up, making sure proper safety protocols were in place, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was only seeing the surface of whatever Marcus was working on. One night, James came home early from his shift to find Marcus in the basement, surrounded by glowing computer screens and bubbling chemical solutions. The boy was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice James's presence for several minutes. When he finally looked up, his eyes had that fever-bright intensity that was becoming increasingly common. "I'm close," Marcus said, his voice thrumming with excitement. "So close to figuring it out. James, what I'm working on, it could change everything. Fix everything." He gestured at his screens where complex molecular structures twisted and reformed. "All those people who think they can control others through fear and pain. I could stop them. All of them." The words sent a chill down James's spine. Not because of what Marcus said, but because of what he didn't say. There was something in his tone that hinted at personal experience, at old wounds transformed into driving purpose. The changes weren't all concerning, though. Marcus had started volunteering at a local youth shelter, spending time with kids who reminded him of his younger self. He showed remarkable patience with them, especially the angry ones, the runners, the ones who'd given up on trust. James would sometimes watch him talking to these children, seeing echoes of their early conversations in the way Marcus carefully built rapport. "They just need someone to see them," Marcus explained when James asked about his volunteer work. "Someone who understands that sometimes the most damaged people are the ones with the most potential to change things." His academic performance soared beyond what anyone had expected. Perfect scores became routine, but it was his independent research that truly set him apart. He spoke at scientific conferences, his age forgotten as he engaged in complex theoretical discussions with leading researchers. But he never shared his personal project, the work that consumed his nights and filled countless encrypted notebooks. The calls from government agencies began during Marcus's junior year. At first, they were just exploratory, questions about his published papers, invitations to special programs. But as his work advanced, the tone of these interactions changed. Men in dark suits started appearing at his scientific presentations, taking careful notes and asking pointed questions about practical applications. James noticed other changes too. Marcus began encrypting all his communications, using sophisticated security protocols that seemed excessive for a high school student. He installed cameras around the house, monitoring systems that would alert him to any unexpected visitors. His computer setup grew more complex, with multiple layers of security that even James's police contacts admitted were impressively sophisticated. The basement lab expanded, filling with equipment that Marcus claimed was donated by interested universities. Late at night, strange sounds would emanate from behind its locked door. Whirring centrifuges, the hum of powerful computers, and sometimes what sounded like muffled explosions from controlled experiments. There were moments when James would catch Marcus staring at news reports of international conflicts or terrorist attacks, with an expression that mixed determination with something darker. His notebooks began featuring calculations relating to dispersal patterns and atmospheric conditions alongside his molecular diagrams. "Everything has dual purposes," Marcus said one evening when James questioned a particularly complex equation. "The same principles that can heal can also harm. The question is who gets to decide which outcome happens." His voice carried a weight that seemed to hold entire worlds of implications. The universities kept calling, their offers becoming increasingly generous, but Marcus remained focused on his private research. He spoke of changing the world, of leveling playing fields, of protecting the vulnerable, but his explanations of how he planned to achieve these goals remained frustratingly vague. James's police instincts warred with his parental pride. He could see the brilliant mind, the passionate drive to make a difference. But he also recognized the patterns of someone working towards something potentially dangerous. The line between savior and threat often came down to perspective and methods, and Marcus seemed to be walking that line with deliberate ambiguity. The morning everything changed began like any other. James was making coffee, watching Marcus devour his third bowl of cereal, while simultaneously typing complex equations into his laptop. The early spring sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting golden light across scattered scientific journals and college acceptance letters that Marcus had yet to open. The pounding on the front door shattered their routine. Before James could react, men in dark suits flooded into the house, badges flashing. FBI, CIA, Homeland Security. Marcus didn't seem surprised. If anything, his expression suggested he'd been expecting this moment, perhaps even planning for it. Marcus Evans. A senior agent stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of national security. "We need you to come with us. Your research has attracted significant attention at the highest levels." James watched as Marcus calmly closed his laptop, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You've figured it out, haven't you?" the boy asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "About the compound?" The agent's expression remained neutral, but her posture tensed slightly. "Your work on synthetic enzyme development has implications. The potential applications for neutralizing chemical weapons alone are unprecedented. But there's more to it than that, isn't there?" Marcus's eyes met James's across the kitchen, carrying years of unspoken conversations in a single glance. "The compound doesn't just neutralize chemical weapons," he said quietly. "It can be modified to neutralize any chemical compound, or enhance it, or transform it entirely. The applications are extensive." The weight of those words settled in the room like lead. James felt his police instincts firing warning signals. This wasn't just about scientific breakthrough. This was about power, about the kind of discovery that could reshape global dynamics. "We've been monitoring your research for months," another agent explained, laying photographs across the kitchen table. They showed Marcus's secret lab work, his encrypted communications, his meetings with various scientific contacts. "The question is, what were you planning to do with it?" Marcus smiled. But it wasn't the smile of the broken child James had found in that warehouse years ago. This was the smile of someone who had rebuilt themselves into something new, something potentially dangerous. That depends on who's asking, doesn't it? And what they plan to do with it themselves. The senior agent stepped closer. There are parties very interested in ensuring this technology is properly contained. The potential for misuse. Misuse? Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. Like using fear as a weapon? Like keeping people powerless because it's convenient for those in control? His hand touched his worn backpack, still his constant companion after all these years. I didn't develop this to give anyone more power over others. I developed it to level the playing field. James noticed Marcus's fingers moving in a pattern he recognized. The same sequence he used to unlock his computer. Somewhere in the house, servers were probably wiping themselves clean, research being encrypted or deleted or transferred to hidden locations. Your foster father is a police officer, the agent said, nodding toward James. He understands the importance of maintaining order, of protecting people from threats they might not even understand. Marcus's laugh was soft, but carried an edge. James taught me that protection doesn't come from control. It comes from empowering people to protect themselves. He stood, shouldering his backpack. I'll come with you. But you should know, what you found, what you think you understand about my research, it's only the surface. The agents moved to escort Marcus to the waiting vehicles outside. James stepped forward, police training warring with parental instinct. Marcus. It's okay, James. Marcus turned back, his expression softening slightly. Remember what you taught me? About how sometimes life puts people in our path for a reason? He glanced at the agents, then back to his foster father. Maybe this is where our paths need to diverge for a while. As Marcus was led to the black SUV waiting outside, James caught a final glimpse of his expression. There was something there, a mix of triumph and concern, of determination and warning. The boy he'd saved years ago had grown into someone capable of changing the world. But whether those changes would bring salvation or chaos remained desperately unclear. The senior agent lingered behind as her colleagues departed with Marcus. Officer Sullivan, she said carefully, given your position and relationship to the subject, we'll need your continued cooperation. There may be developments we need to discuss. James watched the SUV disappear around the corner, carrying his foster son toward an uncertain future. The morning sun caught the edge of Marcus's abandoned coffee cup, steam still rising from its contents. On the table, his notebook lay open to a page of complex formulae, and in the margins, barely visible, was a message that made James's heart stop. Everything can be transformed. The question is who controls the transformation. Years of police work had taught James to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that this was only the beginning. Marcus hadn't been fighting his past trauma. He'd been transforming it into something world-changing. The question that would haunt James in the days and weeks to come was whether that transformation would lead to humanity's salvation or its downfall. The house felt suddenly empty, echoing with the absence of equipment hums and late-night typing. In Marcus's room, the walls of scientific diagrams and cryptic notes seemed less like the work of a brilliant student and more like the blueprint of something much darker, much more profound than anyone had realized. James touched the cross beneath his uniform, Sarah's cross, and wondered if he'd done the right thing all those years ago in that warehouse. Had he saved a lost child? Or had he simply given wings to something that was never meant to fly so high? The answer, he suspected, would reshape not just their lives, but the very fabric of society itself.